Hey everybody, John here with Cruiser Customizing, back in the shop again with our 2016 Victory Cross Country. Today we're going to hook this thing up with some more parts that Arlen Ness sent our way. Today we're going to be getting new mirrors, new handlebars, some billet grips, a new windshield, and some LED turn signals. So let's go ahead and get this thing started. Before we get started, I'm going to be moving a lot of stuff around right above the gas tank, which has a nice painted finish on it. Also, we've got some of our new billet material up there at the top as well. So in case I drop something, I'm going to go ahead and put down a moving blanket over the tank to protect it against any dings or scratches. We'll also be moving this fairing later, so that's just going to give that a little protection. I'll also throw a towel right over top of the front fender. All of this is just to make sure we don't scratch anything while we're putting all our new shiny pieces on. So let's go ahead and get started here. First things first, I actually don't need to remove the mirrors yet, but I'm going to go ahead and get them out of my way because we are going to be replacing them. So I've already broken a lot of this stuff loose just to speed up our video a little bit. So we'll just spin these out of the way here and set them off to the side. Now, working down the side, to get this fairing separated into two pieces, it's got a ton of different screws in it. Most of them you can see. Some of them we actually have to move panels out of the way. So, first thing I'm going to do here is remove this speaker grill. Make sure you're really careful when you start to work this out. I'm actually just using a little plastic pry bar we picked up for a couple bucks down at Harbor Freight. And all you do, just give it a little bit of pressure and then pull out from this outside corner. That just has a rubber grommet that it presses into, and then little tabs that go right up underneath there. So we'll set that off to the side for just a moment. Now I can show you, we've actually got 4 screws down the side on this one. We've got one at the very top. You're going to have a few screws that are exposed. The one we're after is actually right up here in the very, very top corner. That's the only one you need to take apart. The rest of them are going to hold the bracketry for the speaker or some other component that doesn't need to be removed at this time. And then you've got 3 more working down the side. So we can actually go ahead and start to take those out. Again, I went ahead and cracked a lot of these loose just for a little bit of less time taking this thing apart. Next step in removing this front fairing, we're actually going to pop the headlight out. Before I can get to the bolts on the headlight itself, actually back to my little plastic pry bar here again, I just need to pop this bezel out of place. Now again, be super careful. If you take your time popping this stuff out of here, you're not going to scratch any of the paint. And all of this stuff, all of these painted parts, they're fairly expensive, so just take your time when you're popping that out. And as you can see, this thing's just spring loaded on the back, so we'll set it off to the side for just a moment. And now on the inside here, we've got some Allen bolts. We'll just go ahead and use our hex socket here and start removing these. There's going to be 4 on the headlight itself. You've got 2 at the bottom, 2 at the top. There's some Phillips head screws and stuff up in here. Don't worry about any of those. Those are just for adjustment and things of that nature on the headlight. So we're just going to take in the ones that hold in this whole casing here. In the service manual from Victory, it actually says you can go ahead and remove the front fairing at this time. But to be honest with you, I actually found one thing makes it a little bit easier. If I try to pull this off of here now, I don't have a lot of wiggle room. This thing, it's extremely tight, and I tried to pull it off without removing the windshield the first time, and it was nearly impossible. So you can actually just take these 4 screws out, and since we're going to be replacing the windshield anyway, it's not like it's really an extra step. And honestly, This makes the job much, much easier. And you'll see what I'm talking about in just a moment as I pull the fairing off. So once those 4 screws are removed, just give this a little bit of pressure and that windshield just pops right out. We'll set this off to the side real quick. And now with the fairing, it's going to have a little bit of gap right at the very top, which allows me to put some pressure backwards on this. And if you just pop it out from the bottom just a little bit, it'll let the top roll back in. And then the entire thing just slips straight off. Make sure all your wires are in fact disconnected, nothing's tangled up there. And you're done with removing this portion of the fairing. We'll set this off to the side. We've got a couple more bolts we need to get to before we can access the handlebars. We'll go ahead and get those loosened up next. To make sure I have enough room to access those bolts on the handlebars, these 4 bolts that hold in this entire cast bracket here on the top have to be removed. So we'll just go ahead and bust these out of here. You can actually remove this thing all the way instead of trying to push it out of the way, but there's a lot of electrical connections up in the front here, and honestly, I would prefer to leave all of that stuff intact. That way I don't miss a plug whenever I'm going back together with everything, and it's all sealed up nice and tight, just like it was when it came from the factory. So go ahead and get these bolts out of here, and we can scoot the rest of this fairing just off to the side just a little bit. There we go. Now, as you can see, we can manipulate this just a little bit so I can access those handlebar bolts on the back side. Before I loosen up the handlebars, I want to go ahead and break loose or remove everything that I can from the handlebars. It's going to be a lot easier to manipulate this stuff while the bars are there to support everything. So to get started, we've actually got some end caps here. I'm going to pop those off. I'm going to throw a rag over top just to minimize damage. Chances are these are going to get a little marred up, but we're putting on billet hand grips, so we're not really worried about reusing these. That's just a plastic cap that slides in, and like I said, it's going to get a couple teeth marks on it, but they're pressed into place pretty securely. So now I'm going to go ahead, remove the bolts out of the master cylinder and also out of the throttle housing here. Now we can start working on taking off these handlebars. So like I said earlier, we can manipulate this fairing just a little bit to get to those bolts. It'll actually just slip up and right over. So we'll set this off to the side just ever so slightly, and that's going to expose those hex keys right there at the top. Slide around to the other side here so I can break this loose. Make sure as you take everything loose, always be very cautious of where this fairing is, because you don't want to put any undue stress on the wiring that's still connected to that. All right, there's the old bars off. Now we'll go back on with the new ones. Reinstalling the Arlen Ness bars is pretty much going to be the same process, just in reverse. We've got a couple brackets there. We'll put the handlebars back on, and then we'll throw the handle controls, the clutch, brake, throttle, all that good stuff, back onto the new bars. One thing I want to note about the Arlen Ness bars themselves is they've added provisions for running all of your electronics through the bars to keep them hidden. On the factory bars, you can't do that, but there's an opening right here at the bottom. And then this bar system is actually made up of 3 components. You've got the body portion at the bottom, a 90-degree bracket, and also the handle tube that goes at the very top. So All of these are hollow. You can run those wires through there. It'll come up through the 90. You put on that handle tube at the very top, and they've got a small cutout right at the base on these the tubes on the end. That way you can take the wires out of the handlebars at the top and connect them back into your controls on the side. So let's go ahead and get these things mounted into position. Like I said, they just drop right in here into the original brackets. And you're going to want to get this knurled section lined up with the brackets themselves. That's what's going to maintain a positive grip on your elevation that you choose. Go ahead and get one of the brackets started here. Before I tighten everything up on that side, I'm actually going to go ahead and install the clamp on the other side as well. Whenever you're moving this fairing around, just be super careful. You don't want to scratch anything, so just take your time as you move that. Make sure it's secure before you let go of it. Go ahead and grab this other bracket here real quick. After you've got the handlebars snug just a little bit, go ahead and set them at what you think the elevation is going to be, and then we'll drop this fairing back into place. We're just going to do this before we tighten everything down to make sure nothing's going to come in contact with the fairing once everything's torqued into place. So we'll go ahead and put these at about the highest position. And now we can go ahead and carefully move that fairing back out of the way and snug these down. Next up on the install of the handlebars, we're going to throw on the 90-degree brackets. Make sure your Arlen Ness logo and the tightening portion of your Allen bolts is facing towards the front. That's going to put all the pretty stuff out towards what everybody else is going to see. So that's why we're putting all this stuff on here. You want it to look good, so make sure everybody can see those cool engraved Arlen Ness logos. On these, I'm just going to snug them down just a tiny bit. That's just going to keep these 90-degree brackets from rolling all over the place when I start to reinstall these controls. We don't know what the adjustment's going to be on any of these just yet, so I'm not going to torque all the bolts down. One of them will just keep them from spinning around while I put the rest of the handlebar tubes and everything else into place. So whenever you're installing these, again, make sure that cutout that's in the bottom, which is your provisions for the controls coming through the handlebars, make sure it is faced towards the bottom when you get everything installed. And we'll just slide these into each side here. Those actually have painted surfaces on both, so sometimes they can be just a little bit snug. And again, just to make sure nothing's moving around while we put all the controls into place, we'll just give these a quick little torque. Couple things to note real quick before we reinstall all of the controls. On the top of the control housing, there's actually a little peg that sticks out. That lines up to a hole on the bars. That keeps this housing from pitching back and forth, and it's also there to make sure you don't have to really crank down on this housing, causing any of the electronic components inside to distort and fail prematurely. So we need to make sure that that peg lines up to the hole before we put everything back together and start tightening that housing down. Also, this motorcycle comes with a stereo, and the stereo is controlled by this little remote box here. It's got your volume and tune and all that good stuff. That actually doesn't just dangle down here below. Victory installs factory brackets on these, so we need to make sure we put the bracket on as well. This bracket actually has to go on before we put the controls on, so make sure you don't forget that one, or you'll be taking these things back off. But if that happens, you'll be an expert anyway, so no big deal. So let's go ahead and slide this up into place. I'll move the bracket off to the side for just a moment while I get my alignment, and I can feel it lock into place. So now we can throw a couple screws here in the housing. All right, that'll finish up with the controls reinstall on this side. We're going to move around to the other side real quick. Before we reinstall this throttle tube and housing onto the handlebars, there's a couple more steps we need to take care of. One, on the back of the housing here is where our cables come out. These cables are actually not held in place by anything other than the tension on the cable once I put the backing plate onto the housing. Now this backing plate seals up the entire portion of the bottom of the housing here. It's got a little clip that clips in, and then it's got 3 screws that go through it, but you only want to install one of those right now. The short screw here at the back, that's actually going to keep tension on these cables, and it's also going to make sure the cables don't pop off of that throttle tube while we're reinstalling everything. And this also forms the rest of the circle here, so the tension bolts also have something to rest again. We'll mess with those tension bolts shortly. We'll also put in the other 2 housing bolts once we get it installed on the bike. Another thing we need to do before this goes back together is reinstall this bracket. This is probably for one of the OEM accessories from Victory. I'm not sure which one of the products goes on this, but they do have to have a modification when you're installing these new Arlen Ness bars. The bars will conflict with the bracket in its entirety, so we actually just took this one, cut it down a little bit, and removed this portion per the instructions that come with the new Arlen Ness handlebars. So all you got to do is cut that off on the side. You can use a hacksaw, a Dremel. I just used a little grinder wheel, hacked the thing off, cleaned it up a little bit, little black paint, and once this is installed, you can't really see it, so it doesn't have to have a super finish on it. These cool handlebars are going to cover up almost all of that. So we'll go ahead and slide that into place. And then we can also take our throttle tube here on the top, just to get a little bit more clearance. If you're real careful, you can just open up that housing like a clamshell and slide that throttle tube into place. This one, again, it's going to have that little peg right at the top. So we'll just rest it on there until we get it up into close to where its position would be. Then I'll get up here and block the camera so you can't see anything. And there we go, just drops into place there. Now I can grab the screws that hold this housing here and go ahead and get this one tightened up. Before you reinstall the master cylinder, you want to make sure the top 2 bolts on this adjustment bracket at the top are torqued down. Once you install the master cylinder, you're not going to be able to reach them. So I've actually got that loosened up just a little bit, and it's probably going to make it easier to get this bottom bracket in place if you do it before you slide the controls all the way over. So we'll go ahead and slide that into place. And we're going to take up all the slack we can. You don't have to worry about any clearance issues because all your throttle tube and everything is riding off to the side. This isn't going to put any pressure on any of that. So once you've got your bracket in there about where you want it, make sure the rotation of this housing is about where you want it as well. I like my start button rotated just a little bit down so it's out of my way while I'm riding, and then I can easily reach that off switch. So we've got all of that in place, so we'll go ahead and torque these 2 top bolts down. To get your adjustment forward and rearward, you can still reach all of the other 3 adjustment bolts, so you can still loosen these up just a little bit and still have all that full range of motion on the handlebar. So they're still adjustable just as they were before, but you won't be able to adjust this rotation back here on that back housing. So let's go ahead and drop this master cylinder back into place. Make sure you get all the cables routed where they need to go. And this one's going to have a couple Allen screws that hold everything together here. So we'll go ahead and get those started up from the bottom. Rounding out the controls and grips, we've got the clutch side grip. This one actually just slides right onto the handlebar, so its orientation is not going to be selected for us. Again, this has Arlen Ness's name carved into it, so make sure whenever you put these on that you have them in the right orientation. If you do not, these are actually glued into place. You could be riding around for the next couple of years with that thing sitting to the side. Nobody wants to do that. And you've only got one shot on these, so whenever you go to slide this on, just make sure it's going to be symmetrical with that other side, because again, you only get one shot. So let's go ahead and throw some glue on this thing. I actually prefer to put the glue on the grip and the bar, and whenever I'm installing these, instead of just sliding them straight on to get the glue smeared around really well, I'll actually start out about 1/4 of a turn away from where I want to end up. That way that glue just kind of gets mixed around as you start to install everything. All right, so let's get some of this down in the grip itself. This stuff's going to dry fast, so whenever you're sliding it on, make sure you don't take any breaks, all one swift, clean motion. So I'm going to start with that Arlen Ness rocked forward just a little bit. I'll slide it on, and as I'm sliding it, I'm just going to give it a little bit of a twist to make sure all that glue smears around in there. All right, that's it. So that's going to round us out on the grips. Now we can go ahead and start some of the reinstall on all of these fairing components. Before we reinstall the front fairing, we're actually going to swap out these turn signals that are on the front for these new little shorty pieces from Arlen Ness. These things, again, they're billet, they're awesome, they're a lot more stylish, so all we have to do to swap those out is spin this thing around. There's going to be a bolt that runs through on the back side on each one of these. So you just take that thing loose. And it's going to slide right out. Then you can actually slide the new one right into place. There's going to be an alignment pin right down at the bottom. Just make sure you get that lined up whenever you get ready to start this bolt in. That's just going to drop into a small recess there on the front of the fairing. And again, this fairing is plastic, so you don't have to torque down on this thing too tight. Just give it a little 1/4 turn after you get it snug by hand, and that should be just fine. Before we tighten up the fairing stay, make sure you take just a moment to ensure none of these wires are back behind the stay. If you do tighten those up, it could crimp one of the wires, causing a short. We've manipulated this back and forth a few times, so stuff could have gotten moved around. So we've already checked all of our wiring and we're ready to tighten this up. Whenever you're getting ready to put this fairing back into place, I usually just take these turn signal wires and I'll pull them through the front. That'll keep them from dropping down on the inside. I'm also going to take the headlight wiring and just tuck it back into the stay just a little bit. That way all of that's out of my way. Also, I want to make sure that the turn signal wires on the bike are easily accessible. And when you go back on with this, it's got these two little tabs right here at the top. They've got just a little mark tab that hangs down. That's going to slide right into these spots on the upper stay. So we'll actually put this in at just a little bit of an angle. We'll make sure everything lines up as we go on. Once it's lined up at the top, make sure all your wiring is out of the way again. And then you should be able to just pull it down into place. Then it'll pop and kind of lock on there. Once that's in place, we can go ahead and hook up our wiring, and then we're ready to reinstall the headlight. Since we didn't mess with any of the adjustment on the headlight, we should be able to just put this beauty ring back in place. This one just snaps right on there. So we'll just take our time, line up the plastic pins here, and push everything back into place. There we go. Also, before we go up to the windshield, one thing to note, these turn signals came with a plastic wrap on them. I actually left that in place during the install to make sure none of the finish got scratched while I was moving this fairing all over the place. So let's go ahead and put on our new Arlen Ness touring windscreen. This windscreen should be able to just slide right back into place like the original was. So we'll just get it set up here. Start working it down into the fairing a little bit. This is, ooh, that's tight. Take your time, don't push too hard. All right. It actually has this rubber trim all the way across the front here. That's going to create a little bit of a drag on this windshield, but that's also there to make sure you don't have any rattles once you get riding down the road. So once we get this slid in, if you just take your time, work it in slowly, it's going to go in super, super easy. This only has 4 screws that hold it into place. So we'll go ahead and get these started. All right, that's not too bad. Now we're going to pop back around to the back side of the fairing and drop all those bolts back in. All right, that's going to wrap us up on all the bolts that hold the fairing in place. The last thing we've got to do today are install those new LED turn signals on the rear. In case you're wondering, no, I'm not underneath the bike taking a nap. To get to these turn signals, all the wires are buried up underneath of this thing. It's actually a pretty easy install. It only requires a couple tools. You'll want a pair of snips, a little screwdriver, and the proper size Allen wrench. You're also going to want to grab just a couple zip ties so we can return everything to like new. So basically what we've got underneath here are 2 turn signals. These are just bigger. We've got the small new LED units to go on here. So what we're going to do, there's an Allen bolt that holds the turn signal in place. We'll take that loose, take it out, reinstall the new one with it. But we've got to get these wires disconnected inside of here. Everything is up underneath of this fender where it's dark. Once my hands start moving around, you can't see anything. So we'll throw up a couple images we took separately from this video so you can see what I'm doing. But essentially all I'm going to do is use our little cutters here. We're going to cut away the zip ties that hold the wires in place. Pitch those to the side for right now because we got new zip ties to go in. We'll unplug those, then we'll take out the Allen bolt that holds our turn signal in. Replace the new ones, tighten everything back up, zip tie it into place, and we're good to go. So let's go ahead and get started. That's going to round out our installs for today. I hope everybody has enjoyed it. If you have any questions about all these Arlen Ness accessories that we're installing, please leave them for us in the comment section below. As always, you can see every single one of these products on our website. In the description below, there'll be a link to the landing page that all these Arlen Ness products are found on. Check it out, order some up for your ride. You can always subscribe to us so you don't miss out on next week's videos and all the videos we'll have rolling out in the future. There's going to be a logo down in the corner, Cruiser Customizing. Click on it, subscribe. You won't miss out on anything. So that'll wrap us up for today, everybody. Until next week, my name's John. Ride safe.